You are listening to The Evolved Masculine. Whether you are wanting more and better sex, more confidence, healthier relationships, or a greater understanding of and deeper connection to your masculinity, this is the podcast for you. I am your host, Destin Gerek. Welcome, everyone. This is Destin Gerek with the Evolved Masculine podcast, redefining sex, power, and success. Speaking of redefining sex, so over these past several decades, and particularly in this most recent decade, we've been having an increased conversation around what is sex, what is gender, what is sexual orientation, and what is the difference between each of these different labels and ideas. And maybe there's more to who we are as human beings and what's possible for us and our desires and our attractions and our identities than these previously what some would consider very rigid notions of these ideas. And there are folks, some by birth and necessity, some simply by desire, who are actively pushing against these edges, exploring who they are at their most authentic level, and finding, through my lens anyway, finding increased permission to be in that discovery process, creating space so that others have increased permission to be in that discovery process. And it hasn't always been smooth. Not everyone likes this. And then there are those who are doing active pushback, anger, sometimes violence. And there are many others who are just kind of confused, like, what is all this about? All this trans stuff, and what is that? I don't get it. What's going on? And I bring onto the show today in this issue of non-binariness. This is another thing we're going to be talking about, an area that's I'm very much looking forward to, because my own life path with these explorations of masculinity and femininity and polarity and blah, blah, that, I talk about endlessly. I'm constantly curious, like, how this reconciles with these conversations that are coming out of a different camp around the gender binary and being non-binary, etc. So when I met my guest today, Terra Lyn Anderson, at Jaya's event, Path to Passion in Boulder, a couple months ago, and found that, wow, she's able to have this conversation inclusive of both of these parts. I'm like, I got to have you on the show. I often find that these conversations around gender energetics, the masculine, the feminine, is one conversation happening over here, and then there's this whole other conversation around the gender binary and whether any validity, challenging it, etc., happening on this entirely other sphere. So we're going to explore those things. Some parts of this might challenge you. Some might lift a veil and allow you to see things in the world more clearly, but maybe and hopefully even see yourself more clearly. So Terra Lyn Anderson has a master's degree and a series of other letters. I'm not quite sure what they are. Maybe she can explain. RDMT. I'm not sure if that's dimethyltryptamine. LPC intern with the centers the queer, trans, and non-binary community in their work. Part of the things we're going to talk about in their work as a diversity consultant and gender sex therapist in Portland, Oregon. Terra is the owner and visionary of Embody and Merge LLC, a training, consulting, and counseling organization dedicated to ending gender and sexuality-based oppression through education and advocacy. Hence why she's on the show, probably for education and advocacy reasons. Terra is a published author. I've just joined you. certified sex coach and erotic activist working passionately to support the LGBTQ plus community to access greater pleasure, fulfillment, and connection by empowering the body as a guiding force for personal transformation. I love all that. As a queer, gender, non-conforming femme, we'll need to discuss what all that means. Terra pledges themselves. Ooh, I like themself. So interesting, the singularization of the them. Terra pledges themselves to a future where all bodies are free from social oppression to live and love in ways that truly celebrate the beauty in our differences. I mean, you put it that way, it sounds great. So let's explore all of this now. Welcome, Terra Lyn.
Hi, Destin.
Really a pleasure to have you on the show. To be honest, this is what I'm really looking forward to because I get the sense that I'm going to learn a lot through it as well.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it as well. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
So, I just want to preface that we may go into some uncomfortable areas, that these are conversations that are confusing to me too. And I sometimes feel like you have to devote yourself to this if you're going to really understand it. There's so many layers and subtleties and nuance and on one hand, it's great that we're having these conversations, but it just seems messy, like so many of the conversations we're having today. And I guess why don't we start with a little bit about your own journey and how you came to do the work that you do, how you came to identify as, hold on, let's see if I can get this right. Nope, I can't find it now. Queer, gender, non-conforming femme. Each of those is a label of identity. Something that, in all honesty, I tend to feel allergic to and shun. I've always had a hard time with identities, but I know others find them empowering. So, what does all this mean to you? And tell us about you.
Oh, that's such a broad
it is.
place to start. Yeah, so I really appreciate that you are starting this conversation by inviting us into uncomfortable territory, because this really is uncomfortable for a lot of people. And even for those of us who are actively stepping into the conversation by choice, it's very uncomfortable, because by nature, what we're doing by discussing the difference between gender and biological sex and sexual orientation, all of this is really causing us to step into unknown territory and press the edges of our comfort zone, the edges of our awareness. So the reason that I start that way is because I want to start actually going into uncomfortable territory around pronouns. So in the introduction here, there was a couple of different pronouns used for me, and I want to clarify, which is that my pronouns are they and them, themself. It's one of the things that you read there. I don't use she and her pronouns, although a lot of people will see me and make assumptions that they would gender me that way by using she and her pronouns. And I'm happy to explain more about why that's important if you want.
Yeah, I'd love to explore. I want to start by saying, I know I caught myself once, and I'm not sure if perhaps I missed another time. I do apologize for that. There are aspects of this that still feel very new for me, and like I said, I'm still trying to reconcile this with my own path and my own belief systems around gender and identity. That my own path is so out of the box as it is. So then, it feels like sometimes colliding with another, like outside of the pre-existing box way of seeing and doing things, that self has become an increasing force. That I'm recognizing I need to learn and understand more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And my desire is to, like, I don't like to just take something on because this is what you're supposed to do, and this is how you're supposed to do it. I don't work that way in any area of my life. And quite honestly, I think that's one of the places where some people bristle about these conversations, and why I want to have the deeper conversations and going into the uncomfortable places, so that we can make changes due to a real understanding, and not simply because that's what you're supposed to do or you're going to get scolded.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just start there, and just start talking about pronouns, because honestly, when we engage in this conversation, the majority of people, and the conversation that's been happening in the media, centers around two topics: pronouns and bathrooms. And so let's just start with pronouns. So basically, the reason that we're having this conversation is because in the English language, there are a couple of very tiny little words that have larger implications. So for those of you who are like reaching back into your first grade English class and cannot for your life remember the definition of a pronoun, basically it is just a word that is used in place of a noun. And so instead of saying my name over and over and over again, you will use a pronoun rather than saying, oh, Terra this, Terra that, yada, 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 right? So in the English language, pronouns are gendered, he and she. And then they has recently been added to the dictionary in a singular form. It used to, people used to think that it was really just used for plural instances. So the reason why it's important to talk about pronouns is because when you use these really tiny parts of speech and gender is assumed, you're basically in a very, very, very small little moment in communication, validating or invalidating the way in which you see a person. So when someone refers to me with she, her pronouns, I recognize that they see me in a way that I do not see myself. And that has implications on our connection and the way in which we communicate going forward thereafter. And so basically, the reason why we're asking people to step into this conversation is really so that we can connect on a deeper level, and validate and see each other.
So what I appreciate about the way that you describe that is, for you, it sounds like it's about connection versus a feeling of disconnection or separation.
Absolutely.
And that as we move through our life, I mean, a big part of one's life journey is deepening our understanding of who am I? And how do I relate to the world? And how does the world relate to me? And this is the reason why I am very embracing of this, and am happy to make a like, I don't care what you call yourself. If that's what you want me to call you, sure. I mean, it doesn't hurt. I mean, Destin Gerek's not my birth name. And yet it is my identity. And there's so many places, so many different people in their lives shift their identity or the ways in which they like to think of themselves or call themselves. And for the most part, we can embrace that and work with it. And like, especially given the history of marginalization, oppression, violence against people who did not conform to very specific notions of gender or expression. What do you need? How can we help you like deepen into your own humanity and be integrated and welcomed and embraced in that journey? And I'm happy to support that, because I know what my own challenging journey has been like to understand who I am and to be seen the way that I see myself. So I'm here for you.
Absolutely. That's beautifully said, really. It really is, in my mind, the conversation around language surrounding gender and sexual orientation and identity is really genuinely about connection. It's genuinely about how do we create a world that reflects who we are authentically and makes more space for authentic expression. And so with that comes in this next piece that you were asking about, which is labels for identity, and how, maybe that's something that in the past you may have felt like a little bit allergic to, and I feel like a lot of people sort of share.
In this person, I'm still pretty allergic to it. Not for other people. Other people, you can identify however you want. It's been part of my rebel spirit, I suppose. Like, I hate feeling boxed in.
Yeah.
And I tend to find, I have tended to experience labels in that way.
Yes, absolutely. So here's the powerful thing about language and labels, is that it literally has the power to speak something into existence, to create more nuance where there was not nuance before. And for example, the English language, we have basically one word for love. We say, I love my mom, I love my wife, I love my pizza, I love my cat. Those are very different experiences on the inside, the way that you feel about your pizza and the way that you feel about your mother.
Hopefully.
But we have the same word for it. The French, they have, I think it's something like 11 words for love. No wonder in the Western world, the French is the language of love, right? Take Sanskrit. Sanskrit has 96 words for love.
Oh, wow.
96. Can you imagine the nuance that is experienced when you can communicate something with authenticity and conviction such that you have 96 different ways to speak about it?
I like where you're going with this. Please continue.
Yeah. So when we think about identity, when we think about, let's just take gender, for example. The way that we talk about gender currently or in the masses is really that there are two acknowledged, that there are men and that there are women. Now, the issue with that is that there are so many different ways in which people experience their gender that we don't have language for, and that we actually can't communicate and therefore can't connect on in a really authentic and reliable way. And that is why stepping into this conversation is so powerful, because it creates more opportunities for us to see each other in more nuanced ways and therefore connect.
There's something happening inside of me that I can't quite put into words yet, based on what you're saying. Like, I think that I'm recognizing that this conversation has been evolving. Like, I'm turning 42 in a couple of months. Yeah, that the 20-year-olds coming up are going to have a completely different life experience around their identities and around how they relate to themselves and others because of these because of this work that you're doing and others that I feel like I'm in a different, I had a different life experience due to being in a different generation. But with that, I hope that some of the big challenges that I had in figuring out my own journey and how I relate to these notions of being a man versus being a woman will be easier. It will certainly be different than anything I've known.
Yeah, absolutely. It very much will be. And the conversation is evolving in front of our eyes. And the thing is that when a person starts to just loosen their grip on what they think that they know about gender identification, if we're going to stay on that example, it offers more opportunities for them to see themselves as they are currently, no matter how they grew up. And so, we have people of all ages right now stepping into this exploration of how do I really truly experience myself? What words can I use to communicate that so that I can share it with the people that I love, share my authentic self with the people that I love? And I agree with you. The upcoming generations are already really stepping into this conversation. There was an article that was published recently that said something like close to 50% of school-age kids right now are starting to use identifications such as non-binary.
Okay, so let's jump in. First of all, that's a really intense statistic to unpack. But why don't we first speak to this phrase of non-binary?
Right. Okay.
What does that mean?
Let's go there. So this is a great one. So non-binary, when we're talking about a gender binary, we're talking about, like we said, there's two genders. They are quote unquote opposite from another. Men and women are opposites. And they exist on a binary. Now, when we're speaking about non-binary, we're talking about a way of experiencing gender that is either neither male or female, or some version of both, or an experience outside of that identification altogether. The issue, personally, with that word for me, I really believe that people who feel that the label non-binary is empowering for them, I genuinely value that and appreciate that for each person's right to uniquely identify. For me,
this is interesting. You don't connect to it.
I don't. And the reason being is because I don't want to be defined by what I'm not. Mm-hmm. When you look at the word non-binary, it's a definition, it's a label that is identifying somebody based on what they're not. That is like saying, so for those of you who can't see me, I'm holding a coffee cup. That is like saying, I am not coffee cup. That tells you almost nothing about what I actually am. And that is unsatisfactory to me. I want words that tell people about who I am, not just what I am not. And that feels like the exploration, the soup that I really want to be in.
So who are you? What are you?
So in the introduction, I offered the words queer, I offered gender non-conforming, and I offered femme. Those are some words that, as I've really done this exploration, have really started to resonate with me around my gender and identity. For me, queer is an umbrella term that is used for the LGBTQ population in general, but it by definition means slightly adjacent to.
Okay.
And that feels really genuine to me. It's like there are so many things about my life that are slightly adjacent to the norm, and I love that for myself, alongside of the fact that I belong to LGBTQ population. Gender non-conforming, that's the best way I can describe my gender, because I don't get it. I don't get, like, the whole gender construct is falling apart around me the more work that I do in this realm. And so that is how I talk about my gender. I'm not conforming. And
so not conforming to what?
Not conforming to the binary, not conforming to this idea that that there is certain gender roles that are expected of people. I rebel strongly against those things, and choose to redefine them for myself. Those are a few examples.
And well, before I go back, let's and what about femme?
Yeah. So femme to me, while it's used differently for different people, to me, femme just means that I present in a way to the world that people would see as mostly feminine in a lot of ways. I also really, while I have a lot of masculine energy, I tend to lean more on a feminine scale. I just love that about myself, and I want that to be something that people know about me, is that while I don't identify as the letter F that was put on my birth certificate when I was born, I do love all things, well, most things, a lot of things that are feminine, and that, you know, are seen and experienced in that way.
So, again, this is curiosity and exploring. Given this femme aspect to your expression and how you relate to yourself, help us understand what the difference is between that and your clarity around not identifying with female and woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that goes back a little ways. I was in graduate school in my multicultural foundations class when I was studying to be a therapist. And we did a day on just learning about gender. And my teacher started asking us questions about how do we know that we are the gender that we were raised as? What are the ways in which we learned about that gender? What messages came from our family or the media or our friends or school or different institutions? And by the end of that class, I felt like something had cracked inside of me. And I was angry. I was like, quite honestly, like rageful and livid, and spent the rest of, for a long time afterwards, the rest of the year, like just pissed. And I couldn't quite place it. And what I recognized is that I felt brainwashed. I felt that I had been put, like a label had been put onto me, and then I had spent my life adhering to those expectations that came with that label. And it broke me. I felt like my life had been stolen. And I started asking myself, who would I be if not for that? And it felt like the sky opened up. And I started to question, okay, so take body hair, for example. What parts of my body would I want to be smooth if there wasn't an expectation that I shaved certain things? And what parts of what kinds of clothing would I wear if I wasn't expected to do this? Who would I smile at? Who would I make eye contact with if I wasn't expected to? If I wasn't indoctrinated into these ways of being? And that, to me, started to loosen gender norms. And with that, I started to recognize that I felt like way, way, way more than the woman label. And it just, go ahead.
There's some, I'm relating this again back to my own path and journey, but I'm not sure I quite get yet, though, why you can't break all those rules, as women have been doing for several generations, and still identify as a woman.
Yeah, so it's not about that I can't. I could if I was. I absolutely could be there are so many women out there, like you said, that are doing all of those things. Just like there are so many men out there who are doing all of those things.
True.
And when I really tune in to what is true for me, there is a misalignment or a shrinking that happens inside of me when I call myself a woman, when I think of myself that way. When other people talk about me that way, I feel smaller than I am. I just do.
And that's, I absolutely want to honor. And as I said, like whether or not I can really, even if I can't even really understand it, that's a very valid experience.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are things that you want and need in order to help you feel in your fullness,
Mm-hmm.
then I want you to have them, and I want to contribute to that.
Yeah.
And I will say that there are aspects of this I still don't feel like there's something that I'm not quite getting.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm going to turn this back around then.
Please.
Because I've done a lot of explaining of myself in the last 20 minutes or whatever it's been. And
thank you for your willingness, by the way.
Yeah. And right now in my experience, I'm recognizing that I spend way too much of my life explaining myself, and I am so sick of it.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you, mm-hmm. How do you know you are whatever gender you are?
Well, my audience has been paying attention to me for any period of time knows that this has been, a lifelong journey. I feel like I have my own, I have some sort of relationship to this world that, you've built your work around, but it's queer to it. It runs adjacent. I, as a kid, I always thought of myself as a boy, but I was often, a little bit outcast from other boys. I was more focused on my intellect than athletics. I was smaller than most of my peers. And more sensitive in many ways, Then something I speak about a lot lately. It's now it's like I hid it for a long time, and now like when now that I'm not hiding anymore, I realize how much it touches every aspect of my life. That when my high school girlfriend was raped, and I got really scarred around my own masculinity and sexuality, and came to really fear these things in the world and then within myself. And so I kind of further retreated from this masculinity that I was never quite sure what to do with to begin with. Mm-hmm. But I also had really poor role models and around what it is to be a man. Either my own father, who was relatively absent, and my poor relationship with him, and then so much of what's around me was what's today often referred to as toxic masculinity, that I just got this message of like, if that's what it means to be a man, then I'm not interested. And I drew back. And this is one of the reasons why I have my hesitancy about these aspects of the conversation that you're so deep in, is that I did retreat away from what society expected. Mm-hmm. I pulled into and went deep into an exploration of my feminine, largely unconsciously though. And I was seen as queer or gay by many people through my 20s. And even though it wasn't how I felt inside, I explored those aspects of my sexuality because of the social pressures around me, really. If everybody else is seeing this about me, maybe they know something I don't. And ultimately what I found was more true is that I was traumatized. Right. And there were many other instances that I haven't spoken about today that caused the trauma. And that as I confronted those traumas, these wounds around my masculinity, it actually opened up that, wow, I actually really like my masculinity. There's actually a lot here that as I dive into it and explore it and cultivate it, I like this. This feels good. But I still like my feminine parts of myself. I still embrace those parts of myself. And I do at times feel some pull or conflict around various expectations. But mostly I can just stand in my truth and pull what I believe this moment calls for, whether a more masculine expression or more feminine expression. And to me, that's about expanding capacity of what's available to you, freeing shame, and being in full expression, whatever that is. So it's a very different frame than the way in which you've been framing things.
Oh, I love everything that you're saying. I'm so with you. I mean, a couple of points that really jump out to me.
Please.
The experience of tracking back to childhood when these sorts of constructs are in their formation, and the way in which we fit into them is looser than they are as we grow older. And we start to really explore the early aspects of our identity. Just so sweet to hear the reflection on that. And then the way in which life experience and trauma starts to break these things open. I mean, I'm happy to go into this, Destin, but the root of rape culture, I truly believe, has everything to do with gender constructs. And so the way in which those sorts of traumas in life start to bring reflection into ourselves about how we identify and how we relate to these constructs is so powerful. And then the last piece that I really want to speak to is to be wary of conflating gender and energetic polarity.
This is the conversation I wanted to have. Please continue.
Yeah. So this happens so often in these conversations that we believe that male is masculine and female is feminine.
So I don't believe that, but please continue.
Yes, yeah. A lot of people, this is maybe the first time that they're really thinking this through. Because it's stated in our society over and over and over again. And that is problematic because these energies flow and dance in all of us, all of the time. And the way in which we define them is subjective, actually. The way in which one person will define their masculinity is very different than another person. And that is valuable, like holds so much value for each individual. And then, to speak to it, there's also this androgynous energy that exists as well, gets a little bit less airtime, but has been around for just as long. And so let's just lay the foundations for the conversation here, and just define some terms real fast. Gender, if it's okay with you, let's move forward using gender as an internal sense of identity. Okay. Whereas
gender as internal sense of identity.
Yeah. Whereas
let's continue, and I'll see if I can get on board with that.
Yeah. So this is really key to distinguish the difference between gender, biological sex, and sexual orientation, because they have been conflated historically in big ways, which creates mass confusion. So gender is an internal sense of identity. Biological sex is your anatomy, your physiology, your chromosomes, your hormones, what's between your legs, all of that stuff. Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. So those things are very, very different. And then we have energetic polarity.
Yeah, I'd like to add another place, and you tell me if you see us fitting into one of those or if it's separate, which is like role.
Role.
Um,
More, yeah.
like if male, female, masculine, feminine, role being man or woman. With the role of there are a variety of sets of expectations or ideas of what one is supposed to be if you're playing the role of a man or playing the role of a woman.
Yes. Yes. So that I would say, can we call that gender norms?
For now. Yes, I'll play this game with you.
Okay. Yeah, because those roles are a story that we're taught in a big way, and so they're normed by our society, and that's kind of how we learn them. This shows up quite often in same-sex couples. I so often will be walking down the street with my partner and hear a question that's like, who is the man in this relationship? Oh, quite honestly, neither of us are the man in this relationship. Like, what is that? Right? You know, when, you know, some of the jargon that's used in gay communities is, you know, like who's the pitcher, who's the catcher, you know, those sorts of things, like who's the girl. That is, for some people, that's an empowering identity. Okay, great. But to have that label thrown at someone such that they need to fit into that is problematic and quite honestly makes us smaller than we are.
Well, that gets to my larger challenge with labels and identities, period, is that, yes, it's even worse when other people are putting you into a label, identity, or a role and boxing you into it. But there's also the insidious character of where we can box ourselves into a particular way of being. And I have found, like in my own life path, I have found this so much, somewhat with myself, but much more so with other people, whether straight, gay, or otherwise, where people create a label that they then apply to themselves, and now it's, I am this thing. Now this is who I'm supposed to be and how I'm supposed to be, and I am not that, so I'm not supposed to do or be that way. And all of that I find so incredibly limiting. I mean, I had always been more of the vantage point of these notions of like, yay, you know, we got like marriage equality and gay rights are becoming more and more accepted. But I just really viewed it as a stopgap method. Like that's a temporary moment in time that we'll move towards a place where the notion of sexual orientation as an identity isn't going to fit as well anymore, because what I desire is for people to be able to be in their moment-to-moment desire without feeling like this has to suddenly mean this a massive thing about their identity and who they are.
Mm-hmm.
I find it messes people up so much. Just what's your desire in this moment? Can you be with that desire? Does it have to change everything that you think about yourself or how you're supposed to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I have this conversation with clients all the time because, you know, when we start to get really in tune with our authenticity, we recognize that there needs to be a little bit more fluidity for a lot of people in the way in which they see themselves and the way in which they talk about themselves. Yeah, because we change over a lifetime. And there's, you know, identity crises are hard. Yeah, so I agree with you. And also, that doesn't mean that it needs to be either or. It doesn't mean that we have all of these labels and all of these boxes, or we don't. Actually, we are complex enough human beings for us to hold both of those things at the same time.
Okay, I can go with you there.
Okay.
You started to speak about polarity and I cut you off. Please continue.
Yeah. So really quick, just to get everybody onto the same page. Let's talk about these labels real fast. They said it's hurtful when people put you into a label. So when a person is born, the doctor looks at their genitals and assigns them a letter on their birth certificate. This happens to every single person in the Western world.
Well, generally speaking, these days that begins during the sonogram.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. For a lot of people who are going through that process, yes. And so what that means is then the letter on that birth certificate gets tied to their social security number and every institution in which that person goes through life with thereafter, including school, the way that they are raised, the color that their room is painted for a lot of folks, the clothes that are in their wardrobe. It goes on and on and on. And the issue with that is that when we're talking about genitals, we're talking about biological sex. And there are over 80 sex characteristics, from where hair grows on your body to your genitals, to your internal reproductive organs, to the balance of hormones, to your chromosomes. And hardly nobody fits all of those things into an M or an F category based on the way that the medical model shows that they quote unquote should. And so by a doctor assigning a life trajectory by looking at only one of the over 80 sex characteristics that there is, they're assigning that person a label that defines a huge part of their human experience. Now, the reason why we separate biological sex and gender is so that we can create a little bit more flexibility in those things. So that a person can have a letter on a birth certificate or a certain configuration of genitals, chromosomes, and hormones, and still experience themselves in a way that feels true to them rather than how well they fit into a box. Are you with me so far?
So far.
Okay. So the next piece of that then is polarity. So as we start to talk about polarity, if you think historically, if someone the world saw as a woman wanted to wear pants, that person would be thought of as homosexual. Same thing if someone who the world thought was a man wanted to wear a dress, the world would think that person was homosexual.
Well, that one hasn't changed that much yet.
It's really, it's painful to see that happen. Because all that is an article of clothing. That isn't a person's gender, and it certainly doesn't say anything about who that person is aroused by or who that person is attracted to. It is simply an article of clothing. And so when we start to talk about masculinity and femininity and androgyny, what we're talking about is a person's affinities. We start to get into the psychological aspect of who a person is, personality, those sorts of pieces. And depending upon the tradition that you look at, masculinity, femininity, and androgyny have been described in lots of different ways. And so I'm curious about what those things mean to each of us. And if we're really all talking about the same thing when we start to talk about them. What do you think? Oh, you, yeah.
Oh, me? You're not waiting for somebody else to respond? Well, you've used the term androgyny a few times now, but I don't feel like we've given it any sort of a definition. I'm not sure what you mean when you say androgyny.
Yeah, so the way that I see androgyny, and really, I have negative feelings about words that are catch-alls, because it just feels like we're not affording ourselves nuance. But androgyny is one of those things, the way in which I use it. It really means anything that is either both masculine and feminine at the same time, or anything that is neither.
So what would count as neither? Especially because you're speaking of polarity, which I'm still not sure I've heard you really define yet.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if masculine and feminine is viewed through the lens of polarity, which I'll define then as energies that permeate this universe, like two ends of a magnetic pole of north and south pole. One cannot exist without the other. Part of one, they can both attract and repel. Up, down, left, right, light, dark. These are all polarities. And there's a way in which masculine and feminine then have an energetic signature, so to speak, that that affect one another. And again, through both attraction and repulsion. And I believe, and through my realm of looking at these things and exploring them, that you can intentionally play with those energies.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great definition. Let's just go with that.
You define the rest. I'll take this one.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So when we're talking about masculinity and femininity, the issue with polarity is that it feels like a category in which everything must abide. Everything must fit somewhere in there. And the universe is just more complex than that. Human beings are just more complex than that. And so there needs to be both value in the magnetism of two opposing things, and value in the things that are not affected by that magnetism.
Give me an example, because like through my lens, I currently look at 5 minutes from now I might feel differently. I look at things a little bit differently. I do tend to see it as all encompassing. It's not black or white. Like, it's just like there's black and white, there's an infinite number of grays.
Yes, sure. And grays are a mixture of black and white.
Mm-hmm.
But what about blue?
It's a different color.
Right.
In the color scheme of things, one, I think black is all, one of them, you tell me, is like all of the colors, all the spectrums of light combined, and the other is the absence of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. So if we're thinking about that, then there needs to be space in which for us to play around with the things that we can't see.
Yes.
For example, neon. Neon colors cannot be created at all by the colors on the color wheel. But we can see them with the same receptors in our eyeballs as we see every other color. So we're getting into some nitty-gritty sort of places here, and I want to bring us back a little bit to the personhood and identity conversation. The point around androgyny is that there must be room in order for us to continue to expand. There must be room for us to see things that are both and neither masculine or feminine.
Give me an example. Help me understand what would be neither.
Yeah. So go ahead and name some things for me that are masculine, just to kind of see where I want to see kind of how you're identifying those things.
All right, sure. Linear, single-focused, penetrative,
Okay.
Logical, rational, direct, rooted, immovable.
Yeah. Yeah, and then go ahead and name some things that are feminine.
Flow, embodiment, well, I suppose fluidity, circular,
Mm-hmm.
God, there's intuitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So if we're looking at something like, oh, this is just, it's funny because what is the point of these sorts of definitions? And I want to come back to the point is that we're creating language in which for us to use and connect on, right?
Sure.
So if we're looking at something like circular and linear,
Mm-hmm.
what is a half circle? Is a half circle linear or is it circular? It has components of both.
Sure. That's not neither, though.
Right, exactly. So this is both, anything that's both or neither, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a singular point.
Like I tend to believe that all of life carries elements of both.
Yeah.
So the both I get.
Yeah.
Neither I'm not getting.
Yeah.
So you're saying a singular point. You're right. I don't have an answer on that.
Yeah. So, right. So these are things, and androgyny just allows us to consider the things that don't quite fit. And we need to have room for that if we're going to continue to expand and evolve our conversations.
Well, for me, our expansion, our evolution is diversification. I believe the universe in its own evolutionary process tends towards diversity.
Mm.
We are capable of anything and everything.
Right.
Played out within us individually and then played out across 7.5 billion people.
Yeah.
And what this is doing, as far as I can tell, is opening up space for people to discover what else is possible. And so I know that one of the things that you wanted to speak to or discuss was how this conversation is relevant to more than just people who identify as trans or non-binary, but really applies to everybody.
Mm.
If we'll assume that the audience of this podcast is largely men, plenty of women tune in as well, but let's just speak to the men for a moment. Men who may have always identified as hetero, cis oriented or cis-identified men, typically the men who feel the most removed from this conversation.
Yeah.
What's in it for him? Like, what? Yeah. What does he have to really get that's personally relevant for him in this conversation?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. This really is for everybody because everybody experiences gender. Just because some genders you're never really required to think about or ask yourself about doesn't mean that there aren't ways in which those boxes limit you. I have talked to so many men that feel in some way hurt or limited or challenged by gender norms. Things like, it's not okay to cry. Things like, I need to be the one to initiate sex. Things like, it's my job to go to war. Things like, I need to work while my baby is young. Those sorts of pieces.
I have felt every single one of those at varying points.
Yeah. So what's in it for the cisgendered heteronormative men out there is that there is more permission to be all of the ways in which you are naturally inclined to be in this world, if we start to question the constructs that are laid out for us by gender and sexual orientation.
I'm feeling internal conflict. I'm trying to really rest into like what that is.
Yeah.
You know, I want your freedom. I want my own freedom. I want the freedom of everybody who's listening or watching this. I want you to be your most empowered, your most fully expressed. And I think that my conflict has to do with the ways in which, at a certain point in my life, I would have really issued like kind of been repelled by, or like all of those different pieces that you mentioned. But then at the same time, as I've intentionally explored my masculinity, noticed that intentional exploration, I've also found a lot of value in those things. I have found value in working to provide for my family in ways that are hard, that challenge me, that have not always come easy, that the easier thing would be to like pull back, not rise to the occasion. And I think that's one of my concerns, is that I feel like one of the challenges of our time in American society anyway is that we have a lot of people of adult male age who are still showing up as boys, who have, due to poor role modeling or lack thereof or various other things, have not assumed the mantle of responsibility. And my concern with what you just kind of presented is that in that permission, it being taken as, I don't have to take that challenge. I don't have to rise to that responsibility. Because that aspect of my masculinity, I'll speak personally, has been experienced differently than my feminine. There have been aspects of it that have been about challenge, that have been difficult to take on, but that hasn't meant that they weren't for me. And it hasn't meant that they didn't have value, or ultimately that I haven't found greater value on meeting that challenge. And that I feel that I've been able to add greater value to the people in my life and the world from having met that challenge.
Yes. I love this. Okay, so what is happening here is exactly what is happening in our larger societal conversation, which is that we're equating gender with life responsibility. And you can, as a human being, rise to the occasion. You can fulfill your responsibilities. You can have a fulfilling life. You can provide. You can create all of the environmental circumstances that you need to thrive and to care for one another and to raise amazing children and all of these things, no matter what gender you are. And the way in which our society has created stories around who does what and how and why we step into these things limits us. So if you're rising to the occasion because you're a man, in a way that is exclusive, such that women or people who aren't men or women wouldn't rise to the occasion, question that.
I'm going to question you on this for a moment. So first of all, we're getting kind of into the juiciest aspects of this conversation, and I really appreciate your willingness to go here with me. And, you know, my intent is not to invalidate anybody's experience. nor offend, of course. I really am seeking a deeper understanding. In many ways, since marrying my wife and starting a family, I find myself, both of us find ourselves enacting our more traditionally gendered roles more than either one of us ever experienced while we were single out in the world. That this is there are aspects of this I feel like it's rooted in that polarity component, that while single in the world, that it's the moment called for me to need to do more of this, or sometimes more of this, or what have you. But within our relationship and dynamic, and holding the household together, etc., we just, it tends to be easier quite often to hold particular roles just not rigidly.
Yeah.
To not have to, and like, you're not allowed to do that. That's not, but like, for example, I almost exclusively take out the garbage. I almost exclusively hang things on walls, things that require the various tools. 98% of the time, I'm going to be the one doing it. My wife loves cooking and being in the kitchen. Neither one of us necessarily loves doing the dishes. I actually probably do a little bit more of that, mostly because I appreciate all of the fact that she does the majority of the cooking. She'll sew and do that kind of mending, a number of things that are very gendered in our society. And we've discussed this and looked at this because we both like to play, to not feel confined. But I can do a lot of those other things. I tend to not be as good at it, and I tend to not enjoy it as much, but I'll do it. And I built some degree of competency, and I don't have any sort of shame or around doing so. Interestingly, though, I can feel more of a guilt or shame of not doing something that's on some level I carry in my psyche I'm supposed to be able to do or do as the man.
Yes. So that difference between those two things is very interesting to me. And that has some to do with what I'm talking about just allowing our gender norms to loosen enough for us to be able to express ourselves so fully and authentically, free of shame or pressure to fill a certain role. Now, when you're talking about these different activities that are gendered in our society, let's look at why. Let's look at why those things are gendered. Do you have any idea?
It depends on which thing are we speaking about.
Oh, let's just take using tools to hang things on walls and cooking, for example.
Well, there are many men who are incredible cooks. I'm definitely not one of them. I keep saying that I want to take some sort of class to learn how to make like one epic meal, but I think I've been saying it for years. I don't know. I mean, historically speaking, women were seen as being more frail. And power tools and such do not equate to frail delicateness.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that a quality of women that is real or fabricated?
Well, I'm not. Notions of frail and delicate are not really what I. Okay. Here's a place to explore this. I love the feminine. I'm in love with this energetic flavor. And when you speak of frail is a little, let's go with delicate. I tend to think that that many of the problems with how we relate to masculine and feminine in our current culture are have to do with the ways in which we speak about these things that have been associated with feminine as less than, as less important, as less valuable. Delicate is incredible.
Yeah.
Delicate offers so much, and what can even, one of the many things that can be overlooked of what that which is delicate, including or especially a woman in that delicate space can even have a profound effect on a brute man.
Yes.
Can pull him out of that state and bring him into a softer, more aware state.
Sure.
That's powerful.
Oh, it's so powerful. There's two places I'm going to just challenge a little bit here.
Please.
Yeah. A delicate man can also have the same effect on a brute man.
The first thing came up to my mind when you said that, which is very interesting, I like to watch myself in my own thinking, is that it was this notion of the brute man just destroying the delicate man.
Ouch. It's so sad. And also,
and how it can provoke anger and because of these associations. And I think also because the brute man, so to speak, can be enculturated with this notion of you are being some way that you are not supposed to be being.
Well, I'm going to take this one step further, because I understand that, in a heteronormative culture, those things that you just stated might be true, but for example, in friendships between men, those things happen all the time. In love relationships between men, those things happen all the time. To further this, a brute man can also have that impact on a brute man.
Which impact?
Softening.
Well, wouldn't that impact be through his own softening?
Wouldn't that impact be, say that again?
Through his own softening.
That is very variable, depending. And then the other piece that I'm really curious about, and I'm just going to bring this back like one chapter really fast, just to hear your thoughts on it, is around this cooking thing. Is cooking a delicate thing? Is that something that you need to does it take, is cooking delicate?
What it is it's of the senses. And this is an aspect that I don't know why I don't have an easier time connecting into cooking from this place. So part of my history is diving deep into a tantra and tantric philosophy, and cooking is considered one of the 64 dakini arts. And through that lens, I'm like, oh, I should love this. Like, it's an opportunity to sink deep into the senses and all the subtleties and nuances, and being very present, enjoying every moment of that process and what you are in that process of creation. Yeah. And when I'm in the kitchen, I tend to be extremely goal-oriented. I am in the kitchen to get something made so I can eat. Yes. And be done and move on to the next thing, which again is a very masculine type of perspective.
Yep, absolutely. And that's been true of women as long as time.
Again, though, but that's not necessarily. See, sometimes these things are difficult because we're talking about semantics. I don't relate to masculine and feminine the way, like, if our dictionary definitions of masculine is like, that which is associated with men or something like that, and feminine as that which,
Right.
yeah, same thing. And if you look at other cultures throughout time, it hasn't always been written about or associated in that way.
No.
So I think that's where a lot of our problems in the society come from.
Yes.
Is that root definition.
Yes, absolutely. I
So,
so agree. I so agree. So the reason why I brought us all the way back
please.
is because we're talking about characteristics as they are associated or as they are gendered in our society. And characteristics including activities. So you started by talking about the way in which this relationship that you are in, you recognize that you're starting to fulfill more historically gendered roles, and that there's easefulness in that in your relationship. And then we started to kind of tease apart what is why inherently masculine for things like hanging things on the walls with a hammer, and why inherently feminine cooking. And then we started getting into brute, delicate. Okay, and so the reason why I brought us all the way back is because cooking, actually I missed a step. We started talking about frail, and then we changed it to delicate. It was just sort of like a more positive connotation of a similar thing. And even then, the stories around these activities fall apart, because wielding a knife and fire, there's nothing delicate about that. And that is absolutely what it takes to cook.
So this speaks of how these things are not so cut and dry, and how if we look at things from that energetics component, which would view that anything can fall anywhere on this spectrum between these poles of masculine and feminine, that we're never dealing really with a singular energy.
Yeah.
That there are elements of masculine and elements of feminine in whatever the situation is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so therefore, to be able to start to be really critical about when we generalize those qualities to activities and to roles. You're really critical of that, because as we start to think more deeply about it, rather than let those things be assumed, we create more opportunities for us to step into our authenticity.
Yeah, I know that I've been in relationships in my past where I felt much more of my partner's expectations of how I was supposed to be. And including times where I try to conform myself into those notions, and ways in which I sort of could, but they weren't necessarily comfortable.
Yeah.
So that, those are the places where I'm certainly on board with you, and it's been this ongoing journey of finding what really fits well, and now being a father to a young daughter, exploring like how to raise her, because here she's 2 years old, and she very naturally seemed to gravitate towards pink, and playing with dolls definitely came from her, not from us. and yeah, there are these notions through the I think through the psychology profession around the research that showed that girl babies had a propensity towards faces and other humans, whereas boy babies had propensity towards objects and things. And again, those being generalities, and there was always crossover and exceptions to those rules. But we've definitely been finding that. So it's been this like, I want her to be able to find her deepest truths and to be in that that exploration in a confusing world.
Yeah.
Where even the places where we are today, I mean, by the time she's in her teens, let alone in adulthood, it's going to be a different world that I can't pretend to know what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
I just I don't yet know as we go along how I'm fully going to raise her around these notions. I want her to be able to know how to access these energies regardless of what they are, and then ultimately find what feels right for her at a given point in her life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Destin. So when we're talking about research around traits being gendered, all of these things are on a bell curve. So the way in which that works is the majority of people, the highest point on the bell curve, is going to fall in line, right, with a gendered things. That's how we identify what the results of those studies are, right? Mm-hmm. However, like you're saying, there's going to be exceptions to those rules. Now, my interest is not to take away those labels, is not to debunk that research, is none of those things, but is in fact to make the world a less cruel place for the people who fall on the outskirts of that bell curve.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
In full support.
Yes. Yeah, and for your kiddo. Mm. You know, however she ends up finding herself in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you. I mean, to be honest, I could have this conversation with you for another hour easily and explore more and more of these nuances. And as it is, this is probably my longest recording I've done lately. So thank you for, again, your willingness to have these conversations. As you said, I mean, because of the state of our world, you likely find yourself needing to explain these things and explain yourself, whatever, far more than is fair. Mm-hmm. And still in the midst of that, you've chosen and had a willingness to show up here and give us all an opportunity to see into you, into your journey, into your way of seeing the world, into these experiences that you've had, as well as these fields that you have explored and studied very deeply, that many of our listeners, you are the access point for. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Destin.
And how can our audience find out more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am on Facebook and Instagram. The name of my company is Embody Emerge. I am running a course on queer competency for health professionals, therapists, and sex educators who want to reach more diverse communities and serve the LGBT community. And all of my information to schedule phone calls if you want to continue this conversation is on my website.
Yeah, we'll also put links in our show notes for everybody as well.
Awesome.
Any last words of wisdom that you want to leave people with?
I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I really hope that people will recognize in themselves the parts in which this conversation caused their body to contract, and the parts in which this conversation allowed them to relax and find ease in their nervous system, and to be critical of those things, to really ask yourself, why am I feeling those ways in those times, and to be gentle with yourself around that.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And for our listeners, please do explore more of Terra's work and be in this exploration further around your own gender identity, your sense of self, what's available and possible for you. You know, I brought Terra on because I want you to feel free to be you, however you most want to be you, to explore however you want to explore. While we do this work around the evolved masculine, I mean, so much of it for me is that I find that as we're expanding our understanding and exploration around gender, for us to do it effectively, we need to at least have healthy notions of what these things can even be. But I'm not here to decide for you who you're supposed to be. Only you can ultimately come to that conclusion. And hopefully today's episode has both given you greater permission and maybe new avenues to explore as you deepen into your own self. So thank you for joining us. Tune in next week for the Evolved Masculine podcast. And I forget where I was going to go with that. So let's edit this part. So join us next week and tune in. Now I fucked up. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and join us next week and every week for the Evolved Masculine podcast. If you enjoyed this, be sure to give us a rating, comment, and share this podcast everywhere you can. And together we can evolve and rise. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Evolved Masculine podcast. If you liked what you heard, please be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a comment to help other men discover this show and help the Evolved Masculine movement spread. It really does help. I want you to do more than simply consume content, but rather to embody a new way of being and radically transform your life for the better. Join us in the Evolved Masculine membership community, a brotherhood of men who are committed to being the best men that we can be. Crystallize a vision of your most evolved masculine self and implement the tools to take him out of the idea realm and begin embodying him now. Reprogram your sexuality and deepen your understanding of women and the feminine. Learn more and join us at evolvedmasculine.com/membership. I believe in you.